I'm 26 years old, and my name is Tyler. I fell in love with the mother of my best buddy, who was 20 years my senior, which I am aware is incorrect in the eyes of many. Perhaps you agree. However, if you ever saw her, you would understand her, wearing a thin silk dress when you saw her smiling on a calm morning. I reside just outside of Sacramento, and this is a chapter in my life that I will always remember, not a tale to be accepted. A little apartment that constantly has a slight coffee and Windex odor. Or at least I did, until a plumbing catastrophe decided to change my life's course. At 1:30 a.m., the night the kitchen flooded, I was editing pictures. There was a burst pipe, beneath the sink, water everywhere, and I had to leave quickly because the landlord didn't come till the morning. I ended up breaking into my friend Brandon's house because of it. We met through a mutual friend from a few years ago, and despite our different ages, we clicked. He's the type of A-man who attends a community college, wears gym shorts all year, round, and considers energy drinks to be a food group at home to save money. His mother's name is Susan, and I've seen her perhaps twice. A kind greeting at the front entrance, which was away from the kitchen. She exuded a certain suburban serenity, paired but not ostentatious. At the time, I didn't give her the kind of attention. Brandon was already in class the morning after I moved in, so I stepped in. I just expected grass and a coiled hose as I went into the backyard to breathe. Susan appeared in the grass, barefoot, next to the shed as usual. Wearing denim shorts and a worn Stanford t-shirt. Her hair was in an untidy bun as if she had just woken up and she was watering roses. Her skin was softly golden when the sunlight touched it. I couldn't help but stare at someone who wasn't attempting to be noticed, and I froze, not in a spooky way. I didn't intend to gaze, but I did, and my mind only registered. It all seemed so oddly cinematic, like one of those silent independent movie situations where you suddenly understand She looked around as the story was going to change, and I thought I had been subtle. Her eyes met mine, calm yet keen. My heart skipped a beat, and I started to apologize, but she offered me a half-smile before I could say anything, declared, "Come in if you're brave enough." It wasn't even sarcastic, blatantly flirtatious, yet it was also light-hearted and grounded, like a dare that concealed more than it revealed. Then I was shocked when I turned back to the roses and continued watering them, not because I believed it to be significant. Yet, as she had observed my attention to her, she appeared unconcerned. Brandon and I played Call of Duty that evening, and everything felt normal again. Susan was courteous but informal. She stayed in the kitchen or her room primarily, but something had changed. I tried silently for the following 3 days. In order to avoid being in the way, I worked from the guest room using my laptop to edit headshots and send out invoices with color correction. I did the dishes and took out the garbage till my eyes went blurry. Susan would float in and out, which made me feel like a freeloader of the background, as though she were from a more tranquil and gentle planet than mine. She would walk by the doorway and inquire if I needed more coffee. She would silently place a folded towel on the couch's edge. It wouldn't be anything dramatic or obvious, but she was Brandon's mother, and I couldn't stop thinking about the garden and her smile. Wasn't a foolish recent college graduate who was smitten on an older woman or some summer romance waiting to happen, because she grinned at him when I reached adulthood. And for heaven's sake, I had experienced true heartache. So I understood the distinction between reality and fiction, but I couldn't quit watching for her. One night, Brandon attended asked me to a movie with friends, but I declined, stating that I needed to finish the editing. That was only partially true. I sat on the porch because I wanted air and silence and didn't want to be surrounded by people. About 15 minutes later, sipping a beer and watching the last of the light disappear behind the trees, Susan emerged as the screen door creaked. She had her hair loosely pinned and was dressed in a cozy gray sweater and yoga leggings. She sat not too close nor too far away, and she was holding a cup of tea. We began discussing trivial topics at first, like the rising cost of tomatoes. While tending to her garden, she had a serene. Her voice was steady and low, and there was a gentleness in the voice that made it easy to forget the time. She wasn't weak or uninteresting, but I could feel something smoldering behind the words she picked, merely reserved, as if she had once had to be tough for too long. I gave her the PG version of my split when she inquired about it, but it didn't work out. Susan nodded as if she understood the shape of that sorrow, and then she whispered, I needed to breathe. Sometimes we don't know what we really want until we're forced to start over, was spoken that night, almost as an afterthought. I recreated our talk while lying in the guest bed and gazing up at the ceiling, because I couldn't stop thinking about her, even though it was remarkable, and because it seemed so natural. How wrong that she was 45 years old, widowed, and still not particularly captivating. It is to want her. By the end of that week, I realized that I couldn't ignore this. I wasn't sure if she shared my sentiments, but I understood that what I was experiencing wasn't fleeting. Rather, it was the start of something risky, something low-key, slow and genuine. The days that followed left me unsure of whether it was a godsend or the beginning of something I would always regret. Became a silent balancing act. At first glance, Brandon thought everything was normal. He went to class, came home, played video games, and paced the hallway while speaking on the phone with his girlfriend. I stayed to myself while Susan worked. From the dining room, her laptop open, headphones in, and a notepad and pen close by. Photography performed household tasks and attempted to act as though I wasn't seeing every action she took, but I was. Only about attraction. There was a pull to the way she moved that I couldn't describe. Through a room in a relaxed manner, the way she asked brief but meaningful inquiries, I caught myself reading into her smile when it briefly returned for a brief moment after she handed me the sugar. A brief gaze across the kitchen, a palm grazing mine as she handed me a coffee mug, and a quiet that stretched too much to be informal. Perhaps I was just dreaming, but perhaps I wasn't. When I returned after a late editing session that night, Susan was in the living room, and Brandon was out late at the gym. With her phone glasses resting low on her nose and a blanket slung across her legs, I paused in the doorway, looking up, and said, "Can't sleep?" I shrugged. "I could ask you." I froze when she smiled and nodded toward the kitchen, asking for a drink of wine. She poured 2 glasses as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and we sat at the table for a moment before I nodded. Kitchen table. The oversing lamp was the primary source of light, and the shadows softened The talk began light-heartedly, and the room felt safer and smaller. We giggled when she mentioned a ludicrous customer she had that week. A mansion, all decked out in leopard print. Then it changed. I don't believe I've ever asked her why she chose photography, so I paused. The only thing I really enjoyed doing was freezing time and making a moment stand still. Susan nodded slowly. "That makes sense. You seem like someone who quietly observes things. That can be lonely, Susan." She tilted her head and giggled softly. "You're not wrong." She swirled her glass of wine and put it down. "It's all right. You know you need connection, even when we act as though we don't." I glanced at her, then gave her a closer look. "You're brave," she added softly, leaning back a little to examine me with those sharp, perceptive eyes. I like that. There was no dramatic music, no lightning strike, just a sense that something clicked within me. To give her a kiss, but instead, I stood up, cleaned my glass, and said goodnight. Accompanied me to the stairs, and when I turned around, she was still observing. Something changed that night. But it wasn't anything we said. Neither of us made any vows or murmured admissions. The tint of our silence altered, becoming more intense and purposeful. Felt fuller, the looks were longer, and we had more room to maneuver around one another. Drew us closer, as if the home had shrunk. But Brandon didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't mention it. He would chuckle aloud from his room while working on school group assignments and late-night Discord calls. Headset on, totally oblivious to the fact that his mother and his best friend were only down the hall. One morning when I arrived, I noticed Susan staring at me while my friend was handling something unimaginably delicate. Down for coffee. She was wearing jeans and a t-shirt and stood at the sink with her hair damp. She was wearing a loose white button-down shirt, and when our eyes locked, she didn't avert her stare or even smile. Just maintained it for half a second, a bit later than normal. That afternoon, Brandon asked if I could choose. While he was in class, I picked up a parcel from the post office and answered, "Sure, no problem." When I returned, Susan was she was standing in the living room on a business call, one hand on her hip, discussing escrow and price reductions with this low, clipped voice that didn't sound like the woman who discussed tomato pricing at night. She appeared powerful and extremely gorgeous, in a manner that was unrelated to clothing or makeup, and I dropped the package in the kitchen. After a minute, she hung up and turned to face me. Delivery complete. I whispered softly, "Thank you, Tyler." Her eyes locked with mine once more, but this time they remained fixed. We faced each other at the dining table, and they remained motionless for much too long. There was no wine or coffee, just quietly. "I would want to ask you a question," she whispered, tracing the, "Do you feel uneasy with me here?" She has a silver ring on her right hand. I blinked and responded, "No, Susan," as the question came out, so softly that it landed like a whisper. "It's good," she replied, tilting her head with a little smile that touched the corner of her mouth. "But don't act like you have to. Tiptoe, I will not bite." I exhale a gentle breath. "It's not that I simply don't," she said, "don't want to cross any lines." I stared at her. "I don't know," I responded candidly, knowing that she wasn't asking rhetorically, but I examined them closely and thought, maybe the ones that only exist since nobody utters them out. Susan reclined in her chair, and she didn't appear distressed. Instead, she looked like someone carefully contemplating something. "Simple is overrated," she muttered. "I didn't sleep that night, so I lay in the knot because I expected anything, but because it was dark, and I could hear every creak in the house and every gentle footfall in the corridor to occur, but I knew it already included an irreparable, intangible, and your heart tends to follow that line after you cross it in your mind. Occurred on a Friday night while Brandon was away from town for a leadership retreat and scholarship. Program needed. He threw the keys to me and said, "Water the don't burn the place down, plants." I chuckled and said I would take care of everything. I had a shoot downtown that afternoon with a real estate team. That offers a respectable salary, but by the time I arrived home, my back hurt, and my camera smelled like stale lobby air. It was almost 8, and the home was very dark when I yelled, "Hey, I'm back out of habit." With no response, I left my camera bag beside the stairs and went to the kitchen. Was too wired to sit still and too exhausted to cook, so I opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water. When I heard her voice, I assumed she was hungry. Susan, clad in an enormous gray sweater and black leggings, stood barefoot at the edge of the kitchen. Off one shoulder, her face was makeup-free, and her hair was casually knotted back. I responded in a voice that was softer than I intended, but she still looked like something from a picture that I would never dare snap. Grinning, he went to the oven and took out a tray of fish and roasted veggies. The aroma hit me right away. "You figured right," she continued. "I assumed you'd be too exhausted to order takeout." We sat at the table. Just the odd clink of silverware. No background noise, no music. Unconsciously, I heard our breaths dropping. She inquired about my shoot. I asked her how her day went, and she told me about a real estate agent who wore sunglasses indoors. She chuckled. After we finished our meal, everything felt easy. The customer tried to lowball her so much that she almost left the Zoom meeting. She poured 2 glasses of wine, but it was more of a habit than an offer. We went to the light. In the living room remained dim, and she curled up on the couch, legs tucked under her. I took the chair across from her. Even though I wanted to sit next to her so I could feel her warmth and seem like nothing was difficult. Spoke lightly, humorously, and without depth, but then it changed once again. I wasn't always this way. Swirling her glass, she replied, "Reserved." She moved forward a little and placed her drink on the sofa table. "Tell me." Sincerely, I hesitated, and then I gave you more thought than I ought to have. Did not flinch. Instead, she inhaled steadily and softly. Her eyelids flashed, and then she stood up. I feared she may leave. Rather than sitting on the couch, she moved carefully across the room and sat next to me on the armrest of my chair. "Good night. Leave it hanging." Chair. She sat near enough to feel every particle without touching me. She whispered softly, "You're not a kid, Tyler," as she glanced down at her hands, back at me. "Let me make it with you, because I know this might be a mistake. She tentatively tested her fingers against mine before leaning in, but the kiss wasn't. Her lips were warm, and her appetite was genuine. It wasn't hurried. When she withdrew, her breath tasted like wine and something older, like remembrance. I convinced myself that she kept her eyes closed for a fraction of a second longer than normal. Couldn't happen, she said. We shifted to the couch without saying anything and didn't stumble. We took our time. There was no act of seduction, just two exhausted and unrefined people. Since entering something they had been circling for weeks, that the night was about feeling seen at last, not about passion. Nothing was mentioned the following morning. I poured the coffee as Susan prepared breakfast, and we were somewhat silent. When she passed the plate, she lightly touched my shoulder, which felt calm rather than awkward. I doubt Brandon would have observed any changes, but he wasn't present to observe them. The weekend went by in that subdued rhythm, and we didn't need to repeat what had transpired, because it was evident in the way she stood a bit closer and the way her hand lingered. When she handed me a dish towel, we looked at each other across the room for a half-second longer without a word, and when Brandon got back on Sunday night, that was sufficient for the time being. Almost immediately, everything returned to normal. We discussed this over supper. Susan inquired about the camp, and Brandon complained about the poor meals and terrible icebreakers. But nothing had changed. I should have laughed, but the weight of what wasn't being uttered made my chest hurt. That week turned into a Brandon's balancing act involved alternating between exercises, homework, and incessant chats about a lady named Tessa. He would ask me for too many emojis and show me screenshots of their texts. Delivered advice as if nothing had changed, such as the fact that I wasn't sleeping next door to Susan and the lady who reared him. She was an expert at compartmentalization, courteous and laser-focused. But occasionally, as she would walk by and gently tap the back of my chair with her fingers, or she would. Before returning to her laptop, she gave me a brief glance. It wasn't sleazy or even covert. It was silently, purposefully. We were living two lives in one house. Holy. On certain nights, Susan would be outside on the back porch after Brandon had gone to bed. Occasionally joined her while drinking tea, with a blanket draped over her shoulders. Occasionally, I would simply stand in the doorway and observe her silhouette for a bit, before turning away. One evening, perhaps a week later, Brandon had gone out with Tessa, and I was reheating leftover Thai food in the kitchen when we shared our first kiss. Susan, dressed in an enormous flannel shirt, entered the kitchen. She opened the silverware drawer next to me while wearing leggings and wearing her hair in a loose braid. Our hands brushed, but we didn't flinch. "I've been thinking about this. More than I should," she continued, looking up at me with an unreadable face. "Play dumb. Me too." I paused and kept asking myself how this was going to finish. Since feelings inevitably fade, why must it finish with Susan leaning against the counter and crossing her arms? Brandon still doesn't realize that I looked at the floor until reality sets in. She tilted her head. "Don't you admit that we haven't done anything to hurt him?" We moved to the living room after landing harder than I had hoped. As if an unwritten accord had been restored, they sat at opposing ends of the couch. I didn't say anything as I watched the steam rising from my plastic container of noodles as Susan tucked her feet under her. I finally broke the silence, but I'm not sure where this is headed. Please understand that I haven't felt this way in years and that it has nothing to do with my age. Regarding revolt or fantasy, Susan gave me a long glance. "It's you. It's genuine." Tyler said, not just looked at the scene. That really got to me. She spoke with me, deep down, about how she lost her husband at the age of 35 and attempted to find love again in her 40s, and recognizing that most guys either wanted to forget about her or fix her. I gently remarked, "You're not a background character," as she began to feel inconspicuous in her own flesh. "Primary plot." She chuckled quietly but completely that evening, and we didn't. We sat there, two people huddled up in the corners of a room without touching or kissing. We may have had the most intimate moment ever while sitting on the couch drinking tea and listening to the wind rattling the window. Shared, and if I'm being completely honest, that somehow made things more scary. Living in the same home and spending late nights together while wiping hands on dish towels made it clear that it couldn't survive. As if it didn't matter, the change in gravity would eventually be detected by someone, and that someone would unavoidably be Brandon. It began modestly, and one afternoon Brandon returned home. I was in the kitchen making coffee after class, early, and Susan was sitting at the table with her laptop open, but there was a gulf between us. Felt too warm, and I could still hear the reverberation of a glance we had just exchanged. Brandon stopped in the doorway a few seconds ago to take in the scene. His eyes went from me to his mother and back. He didn't say anything, simply nodded, and picked up a protein bar from the cabinet, but when he spoke, "You guys," his tone was strange. "Been spending a lot of time together recently, huh?" Susan didn't miss a beat. "We reside in the same house, honey." He smiled half-heartedly and said, "I guess so." He then turned to leave. The wrapper crinkled louder than he had to as he unwrapped the bar. I thought about Brandon's way of looking at me as if something didn't happen as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. Add up as though he were mentally organizing the parts to see if they would fit the next. He was abnormally quiet, around me for a few days. It wasn't disrespectful or cold, just less chatty and less humorous. The organic flow we'd always experienced began to feel unnatural, like a conversation with background static. Then there was the phone incident, when I had left my phone on the It was unlocked, when I was reaching for something in the garage on the kitchen counter. Perhaps I was being foolish. Brandon didn't jump or scurry like someone caught doing something. When he returned, instead, he stood by it, staring down. He simply looked up at me and remarked, "Your ringtone sounds like one of those depressing independent films." I laughed too soon. "Yes, it's a bit moody." Gave it to me and left. Later that evening, I checked my messages, but there was nothing there. Clearly incriminating. But there was one unsent draft in my text message to Susan that I hadn't. Though I typed it deliberately, it said, "I hate pretending. This doesn't mean anything." Before deleting it, I looked at it for a while. Was he reading into things, or was I reading into him? Susan also noted the shift that evening, something I was unaware of. That night, we sat outside. Once more, she is wrapped in a blanket, and I'm drinking a beer. "Brandon is different," stated. "I know you suspect something." She didn't respond to. Her eyes immediately lingered on the yard's edge, where the tops of the rose bushes were illuminated by the moon. I believe I nodded, uncertain of what she was saying. "He's not a kid," she remarked. "And I think he knows me better than I sometimes give him credit for." Susan turned to me, her voice barely audible, meaning that if it came down to she trailed off, deciding between keeping him safe and carrying on. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even regret. But I'd have to pick him. Truth. I remained silent. We sat there for a little while longer. Neither of us approached, and neither of us said goodnight as we listened to the wind whispering through the grass. When I eventually entered, I saw Brandon standing in the corridor, silently observing. The altercation didn't start right away. Suddenly it grew distant, like summer thunder. At first hardly perceptible, but it was approaching the following day. Brandon entered the kitchen, poured breakfast, and browsed through his phone without saying, "Good morning." I asked him how. As class went on, he answered, "Okay," without looking up. I joked about his preoccupation with protein, but he didn't laugh. Susan didn't come downstairs till after he had left. She was aware that something wasn't right because of how tight she was. Shoulders the way she remained motionless for another beat before grabbing the kettle. She remained silent, and after Brandon had gone to bed that evening, I heard faint footsteps in the Susan knocked on my door in the corridor and entered without saying anything. Putting that behind her, she noticed that her eyes were not normally fatigued. This was the feeling a little worn out from holding your breath for so long. "We can't do this any longer," she said. I know. Susan sat on the edge of the bed with her, hands clenched in her lap. I reached for her hand, and she let me hold it because I don't want to lose you both. "That's not how it works," I murmured quietly. "Because we haven't done anything to hurt him." She shook her head. "Facts. It's about betraying what he thinks is secure." I didn't dispute that she was. Yes, that was always the worst thing about her. We sat there for a while without talking or touching, and then she got up. She gazed at me once more before leaving, her eyes softly remorseful. When I got home from a shoot the following day, Brandon was seated at the kitchen table with his phone and headphones out, looked up and said, "We need to talk." My throat became dry, so I sat carefully across from him. He claimed that previously, when attempting to show me some listing images on Mom's phone, she unintentionally brought up her messages. He mentioned some deleted threads, but I saw enough of Brandon leaning back and folding his arms to ask you to confirm that it's not, "I believe it's because I trusted you, dude." His voice didn't break. It fell. I responded, "Neither did I plan for this to happen." And Brandon scoffed sourly. "You know, she's my mother. It seems like a cliché, and I realize that's incorrect, but it's not a game or phony." He looked at me, for a long time as if he wanted to permanently imprint my face's shape in his mind. He answered, "I'm not sleeping with my mom." And I stood up when he asked me to water the plants, briefly in the hallway before heading upstairs to get my stuff. Susan's look remained the same as I passed her room, but as if someone had taken the oxygen out of the room, her breath stuck in her chest. I moved closer and spoke more quietly. She nodded slowly, and I apologized as well. After Brandon learned that I had stayed at a friend's house, I didn't see Susan for 2 days. Sleeping on a futon in my downtown apartment made my back feel 50 years older. I assumed she needed space, or perhaps I was scared, so I didn't text or phone her of the response if she answered. When my phone buzzed on the third morning, "Susan, could we spoke?" And when I responded, I was already halfway out the door. When I got there, Brandon wasn't home, and the house felt smaller in some way. There was a heavy silence. I discovered her in the kitchen, standing at the window, drinking tea, and gazing out at the garden with an almost expectant expression. Didn't immediately turn around, but when she did, I saw that something had changed. Her skin was pale, and there was light in her. She didn't waste time because I received a call from my doctor. Her eyes appeared to have darkened as if someone had reduced the saturation on her. Susan looked down at her cup and whispered softly, "A week ago, I froze. The little tumor was diagnosed as breast cancer after a biopsy, but the words didn't register. When I initially heard it, it seemed like a strange language was being spoken underwater. They believe it's early, but I have to take urgent action," she said. I moved ahead out of instinct, possibly due to radiation, chemotherapy, or surgery. "Why didn't you?" "I didn't want you to come running, so why don't you tell me?" She glanced looking up at me at that moment, and her eyes weren't simply weary. They were afraid. Since I didn't, I grabbed for her hand, but she only gave it to me softly. "I wanted this to be the thing that breaks you. It doesn't alter my feelings, it just clarifies them." Susan gave me a small smile. She released my hand, and "I'm taking off. You always say the right thing, and I mean it." She advised me to stay with my sister in Arizona for treatment for at least a month. The floor moved under me. "I'd like to accompany you," she said, shaking her head. "No, why not?" That went deeper than anything Brandon had said, "Because you're not mine to keep. You don't get to decide that for me. She said, "I'm asking you to respect what I need," and I swallowed it without making a decision for you. For the first time in weeks, she glanced at me and asked, "What do you need?" There was no protection in her voice. I must face this without worrying that I'm hurting someone else. I nodded in agreement to be permitted to be weak, but it was capitulation. "I told you that if you don't want to vanish, then just remain where I can find you." I was unable to sleep that night, so I lay in the guest room and stared at the ceiling fan as I couldn't stop thinking about her as it whirled gently and repeatedly, seemingly unconcerned by the changes beneath it. It broke something inside of me, but not in a good way. I need to be allowed to be weak. Bitterly, creating space for something more profound. At around midnight, I heard Susan was standing in the doorway, barefoot, wearing a loose blue shirt, when there was a gentle knock. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her hair down and a little untidy as if she hadn't attempted to combat the exhaustion any longer. Responded, "Me neither." She entered, and I walked over to where she lay next to me. Not beneath, I could hear her breathing even though the covers weren't touching me. We were silent for a long time until she muttered, I'm scared. Like you, I can't stop wondering what might happen if I return and everything has changed. Wanted to lie and claim it wouldn't be. But we were past the easy part. Reassurances. It most likely will be, I remarked, and she agreed. I simply don't want this to be what we've... I reached for her hand this time, and she grasped mine firmly. It must have seemed like something occurred to us, I remarked. Every aspect of it made her eyes water, yet she refrained from crying. She said, "Assure me that you won't vanish while I'm away." "Won't, and I'll still be here if I return." She softly pressed her forehead. "I'm concerned that it's against my shoulder, which is why I didn't sleep that night." Though we lay there in the dark, saying more with our silence than words could ever express, I don't think she did either. Brandon didn't show up when I drove her to the airport the following morning. He claimed to have a midterm, which may or may not be the case. We didn't talk much on the way, so perhaps it was simpler for him to avoid saying goodbye. The majority of her hands were folded on her lap as she gazed out the window, and I kept looking over to try to remember her profile, the way her jaw curved and her unblinking smile when she caught. She turned to face me as I grabbed her suitcase from the trunk while I was peering at the terminal, hugged me for a brief, non-dramatic but sincere moment. This need not be the end. "I know," she said. But there was a pause before she gave me a non-desperate kiss. It wasn't hurried. Rather, it was calm and gentle, like the final punctuation. "Mark, I'll text you when I land," she continued, adding that neither of us wanted to finish. Tightened my throat and nodded. "Take care of yourself, Susan. You too, Tyler." Brandon was in the living room when I put my headphones back, and she was gone. The drive home felt longer than it should have. He didn't glance up and didn't say anything, so I passed him with my laptop open and left. I went directly to the guest room, closed the door, and perched on the side of the bed. It was quiet, but not deserted. Something remained alive between us in the silence, and I clung to it when Susan returned 3 weeks later. Picked her up from the airport shortly after 9:01 p.m. She appeared softer around the edges, but not particularly weak. She had a light scarf over her neck, and her hair was tied up in a way that appeared more functional than stylish. We didn't talk much during the ride, despite the nice night. "How's Brandon?" she asked finally. "He's silent," I said intently. "Are you familiar with him?" With a little smile, she said, "I do want to ask if she was afraid, the way the treatment went, but something in our relationship told me we'd get there, just not yet." Brandon's car had a porch light on when we drove into the driveway. The house appeared to have remained unchanged from the outside, although... "Thanks," I said, carrying her luggage inside and placing it in the hallway. "You didn't really give me a choice," she said after picking me up. I said, and she gave me that half smile that held more history than it was entitled to. After a few moments "I'm pleased you came," she replied, reaching out and touching my arm. "Despite all I told you, I wasn't going to." She softened her gaze, but before one of us could continue, Brandon showed up at the top of the stairs and said, "Hey." Susan turned and responded, "Hey, baby." Nodding, he walked gently down and gave her a brief but warm hug. He added, "There's some left if you want," and she said, "Thanks. I had made tea." As he went by, he brushed his arm and looked at me. Our eyes met, and there was no hostility. This time, there was something more difficult to read in his eyes. Not forgiveness, but perhaps comprehension, or perhaps simply perseverance. The three of us stood in the kitchen. Like actors in a silent drama, I grabbed my luggage and prepared to leave, but, "Are you staying for a bit?" Brandon said, pausing before I replied. "If that's okay?" He glanced at, "I guess it's your turn to take the couch," he replied, turning back to me after speaking to his mother. Joking, but not totally. Susan grinned. I lay on the living room floor that night. The air felt heavy, not from strain, but from the weight of what hadn't been said. When the stillness eventually broke the following morning, I was drinking. Susan joined me, tightening her cardigan over herself while we were enjoying coffee on the porch. She replied, "He knows," and I thought, "Not everything, but enough." I nodded, believe he's attempting to shield me," she said, "and discipline you, and perhaps pardon us both." I remained silent, hoping that silence would speak for us. Susan gazed out at the backyard, where the roses she had been so proud of were withering from the summer heat, and wondered whether she could postpone the inevitable. She whispered, "Heat. I've been thinking about what comes next. I felt it before." She turned to face me, her voice firm, and even murmured that quiet, preparatory anguish that tightened in my chest. "Kind Tyler. I suppose a piece of me will always be there for you." Swallowed, but I wanted to fight her because this couldn't be our life. Telling her that she was mistaken, and that we could work things out, and that true love wasn't something you should let go of because it was annoying. But I didn't, because I knew in my heart that she wasn't. Susan's voice was low as she replied, "I'm not ashamed of what we had." She glanced down at a stray thread on her sleeve, but I'm not either. However, I am aware that I am not the type of woman who can have a covert existence. I've done that too many times in various ways, and I can't do it again, not even for you. I didn't argue that I couldn't, because her words weren't harsh. Rather, they were sincere, and throughout the weeks that we had spent together, honesty had brought us closer, kept us together longer than either of us had anticipated, and you are worthy of more than bits of. I attempted to reply, and she said, "You deserve a love you don't have to explain." However, my voice broke. "What's happening now?" Susan glanced out at the roses once again. Back at me, her eyes were clear and tearless as you finished repairing your dwelling. "You return, and we resume our friendship or our previous shared beauty." I nodded slowly. I said, "I just wanted to say thank you," and she cocked her head slightly. Her smile was genuine and little, and she wasn't acting like this was a mistake. It wasn't you. Showed me what it's like to be wanted, not out of sympathy or longing. However, I will never forget that, neither will I. We didn't cry and we didn't embrace. We simply stood side by side in the sun for a few more breaths, allowing the silence to speak for us. A few days later, I informed Brandon that I needed my own place again after my apartment was properly fixed when I moved out. But he didn't. Added, his mom would probably miss having someone else do the dishes for once, and gave me a shoulder clap. When I returned a week later to get a box I had left in the closet, Susan was waiting for me at the door, barefoot. Her hair was up, and she was wearing trousers and a delicate blue top. Her grin was little. Gave me the box. For a while, neither of us moved. "Be careful. You too," she continued. "Of yourself, Tyler." With that, I left without being broken. Not resentful, but thankful for what we had, which was real, but not forever. Sometimes that's plenty. When I returned to the flat, it felt like mine again, but it was still cracked. The tile at the bathroom door showed the same distant blinking freeway, but it was now quieter. Or perhaps I was. Quieter. I unpacked without music or other distractions, only the gentle murmur of. There was the occasional creak from the pipes that still hadn't been mended properly, and tape being torn from cardboard, for I spent a few days sitting with my coffee and not doing anything. I didn't photograph or edit. The morning spent gazing out the window, allowing silence to envelop me like a cloak I no longer knew fit. Susan didn't text, and I didn't think she would. There was a sacred quality to keeping something unaltered after you've Brandon sent me. A message that said, "Let it go the right way." We hadn't broken up and had freed each other. A ridiculous meme 2 weeks later about photographers always wearing black, even in the heat, to which I responded with a, "He said nothing else, so I started shooting at him. Single. LOL. Once more, slowly, a moody engagement photo shoot in old Sacramento and a family portrait session. After that, there was a wedding where the groom sobbed so much throughout his vows that I nearly camera down. Susan existed, and I wasn't attempting to forget her or to preserve her in memory. Existed, but we no longer did. One evening, roughly 6 weeks after I departed, I received and Brandon sent the email, which had the subject line, "For you." There was no message, simply a photo attachment, and when I opened it, I saw a picture of Susan sitting on the back porch, with her legs crossed and a tea mug in her hands, holding a book. She was giggling at something outside the screen, most likely something Brandon had said while she was sitting on her lap. Her eyes were wide open and vibrant, yet her scarf was gone and her hair was thinner. Brandon typed a single phrase on the photograph. "She still talks about you." Thank you. I looked at the computer for a while before responding, telling her that I appreciated her reminder that she's still entitled to feel things, still see her, even though I was unsure whether he would. But it made little difference. I slept with the window open that night, and the buzzing sound of the freeway filled the background like an old-fashioned lullaby. I close my eyes and allow it to lead me into sleep as someone who previously possessed something unique, not as someone who has lost something. Sometimes that's all a heart can do. Requires a chapter that concludes appropriately, rather than a conclusion, just like autumn did. Sacramento always has slow, uncertain weather, and the leaves didn't turn all at once. They paused as if they weren't quite prepared to release the heat. Like me, Susan had not returned for 2 months after that picture. Brandon's email was followed by nothing else, no texts or late-night calls. Just the quiet of those who were no longer around the same fire. But that didn't mean it had extinguished. Discovered that I was going back to places I hadn't intended to, like an old cafe off J Street where Susan used to get pancakes for supper, the hill behind her neighborhood where we used to sit in my car, and the nursery where she purchased her climbing roses. We both remained silent, merely gazing at the skies and acting as though nothing was heavy. I began shooting more since it felt more like the soft, mellow pain that comes from a healed scar. Images of elderly couples, bereaved veterans, single mothers, and their children that were the result of personal projects. In their eyes, I discovered fragments of Susan, or perhaps just her myself, as I was when I was in love with her one afternoon. I stumbled while editing. I came into a forgotten folder on my drive and porch at nightfall. It contained a series of pictures of Susan that I had secretly started. She hadn't known about the majority of them. I hadn't planned it. But in those fleeting moments when the light struck her just right, occurred in one where she was giggling at something I had said while drinking tea barefoot. Another one shows her reading beneath the porch light while the glasses slide down her nose, and the final one shows her not even looking at the among the blooms. The camera stood with a palm resting on her shoulder, as if she were trying to recall something that matters. I looked at that one for a long time without smiling or crying. Simply I sat there and let the picture serve as a reminder that certain things are genuine without having to be repeated. I recalled that I was leaving a downtown bookstore with a used edition of On Sunday Afternoon when I ran into her again. I was holding a camera when I heard my name called, so I turned and stood up. Susan. She appeared lighter, not younger, as she wore trousers and a pale green top across the street with sunglasses pulled up in her hair. "Hey," I said as if we were approaching each other without saying anything. Not older, simply unburdened. She grinned and continued to gather strange photo albums, but she hadn't once uttered vows under porch lights. She chuckled at those with margin notes and shattered spines, and for a brief period it seemed as though nothing had changed, but everything had. After a little stroll, we discovered a peaceful bench behind a sycamore tree. There were only 2 persons seated in a more relaxed manner, with no small talk or awkwardness. Something only appears after you've said all the necessary things. "How are you?" At last, I inquired. "Getting better," she stated. "I'm still receiving treatment, but it's working." She looked. There was a pause, and I noticed one of your portraits. "You look well, and I do," the woman with the silver braid and tattooed hands remarked. "At that coffee shop near 9th. And I grinned. Martha. 3 times widowed. She smoked menthols and drank whiskey at 10 in the morning. She appeared. She nodded. "You did that." I turned to her because that's how I want people to feel. I know there was another silence, but it didn't feel like it was coming to an end. "I'm glad we had what we had," she added, even though it felt like a door gently closing. "Didn't need to," I said. It wasn't meant to be seen by her. Shimmered, but no tears fell. We didn't give her a hug or bid her farewell. She simply liked punctuation. At the conclusion of a quiet, significant sentence, it delicately stroked my arm, and left. I saw her go around the bend and blend into the throng. I didn't feel the need to follow some love for the first time in a long time. Some stories are only supposed to occur in order to change something within you, and serve as a reminder that if you're lucky, they leave you with just enough light to keep you alive. I'm not sure if that was pure love, but I do know that for a brief moment, we actually saw each other, and sometimes that's sufficient. I appreciate you listening, all the way through. Thank you, and I'll see you again.